If you have a child or were having a child, and you only had 10 speeches, roughly 249 verses, to impart wisdom to them, what would you talk about? This is the type of question that sets up Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8 through Proverbs 9. And of all the themes in those verses, one negative theme rises to the top. Of those roughly 249 verses, around 65 of them deal with a character called the adulterous woman. It's around 25%. We can't talk about Proverbs, we can't talk about wise living unless we talk about this theme. So yes, this is a sermon about sex. You're welcome. Glad you made it this morning. You needed this summer, right? Come on. I'm not uncomfortable, you're uncomfortable. There's a trend in our culture that looks at the Christian sexual ethic, sex reserved for one man, one woman marriage, and calls it backwards and repressive. But an interesting thought experiment to conduct is to ask yourself, what if we all did this? What would happen to the world if we committed ourselves to each other before having sex? What would happen to the world if we didn't just deal with the issues of adultery, but the root issue of lust? Crimes of passion go down in a shocking percentage. People can go running at night without fear. No more sexual abuse by pastors and priests. Marriages aren't broken up by discovering secret text messages or surprising credit card charges. Is this world worse than the one that we inhabit, this imagined world? I don't think so. We need to talk about sex, adultery, and lust. We want skill in the art of living, wisdom, and a major foundation for wisdom is sexual self-control. But more, Proverbs 1-9, we're going to see, uses the theme of this character, this adulterous woman, as a foil for wisdom. It's a metaphor. It's an allegory for foolishness in general. The whole book of Proverbs is asking the supposed young man who is its audience, who are you going to choose? Who's going to be your partner for life? Wisdom or folly? So as we explore these things, I'm doing things a little differently than I normally do because I want to be precise today. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this type of thing than we normally do. We're going to try and be careful, going to try and be delicate. Just want to turn the temperature down on these conversations in general this morning. So if you've got your Bible, you can open it with me to Proverbs chapter 2, starting at verse 16, where we read, "Wisdom will save you also from the adulterous woman, from the wayward woman with her seductive words, who has left the partner of her youth and ignored the covenant she made before God. Surely her house leads down to death, and her paths to the spirits of the dead. None who go to her return or attain the paths of life." Out the gate, we have to deal with a significant cultural issue. Lust does not have a gender. Lust doesn't have a gender. Why do we need to be reminded of this? Well, there's a simplistic reading of Proverbs that seems to make women out to be more guilty of creating sexual issues than men. It's a simplistic reading that was adapted by the early Jewish community and put into cultural practice. Jewish law made it so that men weren't supposed to speak with a woman who was not their wife or their close relative. A brief example of how this got put on the shoulders of women more is in John chapter 8, at the very beginning of the chapter, we get told the story, and what's it usually titled? The woman caught in adultery. What happens in that story? The pious men of the city drag this poor woman out before Jesus and ask whether or not they should stone her to death. Have you ever read that passage and then done the math and been like, I'm pretty sure you can't commit adultery alone? Where's the dude? Where's the man? See, Proverbs is not blaming adultery on women. There's a few reasons we see for this characterization in the feminine. First, this is a poem, okay? It's poetry. And in the world of the poem, we've got a father and in the background a mother giving advice to a young man. So they personify this character in the feminine. Lest we forget, wisdom is a woman too. Also, the words used to describe this character focus less on her gender and more on her moral character. The key word that's used and often translated adulteress in Hebrew actually means strange. Not as in like weird, but as in like foreign or alien. And you're like, oh, great, Ricky, so the Bible's not just sexist, it's racist now. Hold on, Tiger, okay? Strangeness doesn't mean from another nation. We just read she's left the covenant partner of her youth and ignored the covenant she made before God. This is an Israelite. This is somebody who's in the community of faith, but they're not of the community of faith. They're an ideological stranger, not living by the morals and codes of the Israelites. The language is placing emphasis on moral character, not gender. And finally, Proverbs is using this, as we're going to see again, Proverbs is using this character as a foil for wisdom. It's a metaphor, an allegory. Adultery becomes the allegory for foolishness. And it's held up against wisdom, and it's asking us who we're going to choose. Now, I believe we need to talk about this issue because many of us who grew up in Christian culture were given a similarly gendered story about lust and adultery. I grew up in early 2000s evangelical youth group. Horror stories abound, okay? Every young man had his battle, and every young woman got the modesty talk 4 to 6 times a year while the boys played basketball. The result? Girls learn to see their bodies as hazardous substances, something that might cause their brothers to stumble. And boys absorb this message that we're basically sex-obsessed monkeys who need to get married to solve the problem of our lust. This framework taught women that their value was in guarding sex, and it taught men that they had no real agency. As Pastor Trish said when we were talking about it this week, women become gatekeepers of the sex that men supposedly need. And overgeneralizations like these, they damage both genders. Men need a vision where sexuality is about connection, not conquest. Women need to be able to talk about and experience being in their bodies and not like as temples of the Holy Spirit, not just hazardous substances. I've heard so many stories from women and men about how truncated this narrative is, and from women in particular, how they felt ashamed, objectified, or blamed, or struggled with intimacy as a result of these narratives. We need a wiser way forward. Lust doesn't have a gender. This is a human issue. Jesus' voice, of course, needs to be the clearest on this topic. And in Matthew 5, when he speaks about adultery, he roots it in lust. And he says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Jesus is speaking to men here, but again, the gender isn't important. He's giving us a principle, and the principle is this, that the responsibility for lust is on the behalf of the luster. The one who looks lustfully is the guilty party. Right? Jesus also reminds us later to take the plank out of our own eye before dealing with the speck in others' eyes, which I think calls us to a level of personal responsibility for lust and its outworking in our lives. It's a human issue. We shouldn't fall back on overgeneralizations and stereotypes. They damage us. Each of us has a unique story in this area, and we need to honor it and ask God for wisdom in it. Deep breath. How do we talk about this then? How do we talk about sex? How do we hold each other to the biblical standard of sex within like one man, one woman marriage? Well, Proverbs again gives us wisdom on a positive perspective on sex and sexuality as well. In Proverbs 5, starting at verse 15, we read, "Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares, let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breasts satisfy you always. You didn't think you were going to hear that in church this morning. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Why, my son, be intoxicated with another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? For your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of their sin hold them fast. For lack of discipline they will die, led astray by their own great folly. Let's just own that both Christian and secular culture these days is sex obsessed. There is an industry from porn to podcasts to pop psychology telling us what sex should be like, how much we should be having it, and whether or not we're normal. And we get these not so subtle messages that if we're not having like mind-blowing, carefree sex all the time, there's something wrong with us. We need to put sex back in its proper place. The father in Proverbs uses a metaphor, a well. The well is not sex, it's a person. The well is the wife, current or future, of the young man who's the intended audience. Women and wells are usually connected in the Old Testament. Men meet their future wives at wells. Don't worry, ladies, being called a well in the desert is a good thing in ancient Israel, okay? It is a gendered metaphor, but I think it reaches beyond just the woman and speaks to the relationship between the man and the woman. It's talking about how our marriage relationships are supposed to be sources of life and refreshment. Blue Jetta, blue golf. Who's got a blue golf? Nice, okay. Well done. I just couldn't keep going. I can't talk about something this serious with an alarm going off behind me. I'm sorry. Let me say that again. The well is a metaphor for how our marriage relationships are supposed to be sources of refreshment and life. Our marriages are supposed to be wells in the desert, and sex is a good gift that is given to strengthen and deepen those relationships. Right? We're encouraged by Proverbs to enjoy this relationship with our spouses, that sex is supposed to bring us joy. And some of you might be thinking about 1 Corinthians 7 with what I said previously and with what I'm saying now, where Paul does talk about how we're not supposed to needlessly withhold sex from each other within marriage, but we're supposed to freely give it to one another because of our lack of self-control. This passage has been severely abused by some people and plays into this narrative that you just need to give sex to one partner as a duty and an obligation. And I think that's probably not what Paul had in mind when he wrote it. Paul talks about how physical intimacy is the becoming one, it's becoming one flesh, how we're supposed to be mutually self-submissive, right? Sacrificing for one another. If physical intimacy isn't happening within your marriage at all, right, that's a sign probably, if it's not because of illness or injury, that something needs care, connection, love, and healing, right? Not really a time to start making authoritarian demands. It's probably time to have a conversation, right? Because it's part of the relationship. Right, we're digging a deep well, not going to 7-Eleven to buy some bottled water with this stuff, okay? And there's joy and satisfaction on the other side of this work. I mean, physical intimacy in a marriage is like a little slice of the Garden of Eden, where you can be known fully and loved fully, where you can be naked and unashamed, literally and figuratively. It's a beautiful thing. And breaking our commitment to our spouse, or breaking somebody else's commitment, or engaging in sex outside these boundaries is described by the Father as pouring water out on the street. What happens? It just dries up if it's poured out on the street. Whereas cultivating a committed covenant relationship is presented as digging a deep well. Right? Proverbs is encouraging us to seek the value of long-term relationship, of covenant love, rather than the pleasure of a short-term tryst. Now, not all of us, though, have these relationships. Not all of us are married, or there are complications in our marriage. And again, we're given these not-so-subtle pressures about what kind of sex we should be having and what it should look like. And it's important, we need, anytime we talk about this, to remember the most truly human person who ever lived, Jesus Christ, didn't have sex. Paul celebrates celibacy as a better way of life, he says. Some of us are single, voluntarily or involuntarily. Some of us are divorced. Or if we are married, some of us are married to people who are very ill or differently abled. Some of us have a history of abuse and trauma that makes physical intimacy difficult for us. Or we're just like super hormonal teenagers who are struggling with like staying pure in a world like what we inhabit. And we'll absorb the message from our culture that if we're in any of those states, we're like riding the bench of life. We're like missing out on being fully human. That is not what Scripture teaches, okay? A fully human life doesn't have to have some kind of like sexual relationship like what's presented within our culture. Now, I'm really just trying to speak about these things in a way that I wish somebody would have talked to me about them when I was a young man, to remind me that physical intimacy is the culmination of a meaningful relationship, that sex is very important, but it's not the most important thing in the world, and also that the fear and shame tactics that were used on me as a child, I wish they weren't used on me. Man, I remember like people passing vases around and spitting in them and saying this is what it's like if you have sex before you're married, or like gluing pieces of paper together and tearing them apart. And it's brutal, it's awful, and some of us are sitting here and we've got complicated histories and we're like ashamed and afraid. Be at peace. Some of the most important figures in the history of Christianity had complicated sexual histories, and God used them powerfully. We also absorb this idea that God really, really hates sexual sin, and that like it's like harder for him to forgive or something, and that we like ruin our future marriage if we've engaged in it. I know many people who have phenomenal marriages who have complicated histories. All of this reminds me of something that Peter of Damascus, this Orthodox priest, once said. Even if you sin, you shouldn't despair. It's bad enough you've sinned. Why, in addition, do you wrong God by regarding him in your ignorance as powerless? Is he who for your sake created the great universe that you behold incapable of saving your soul? And I would add giving life to your body. Right? The practical outworkings of a lot of teachings on sex and sexuality essentially limit the love of God and put a cap on the power of God. And both of those things are heresy. Jesus' grace is sufficient. His power is unending. His love doesn't have limits, right? He paid it all. So be at peace. Accept that grace. Go and sin no more. And more importantly, as a Christian community, give that grace to the people that you meet. Give that grace to the people who share their stories with you. Right? Be like Jesus. Now, the Father closes this little kind of statement with a warning. Those who wander into the bed of the stranger die for lack of discipline. Because of their great folly, they are lost. One of the things I love about the Bible is how realistic it is. I don't know how we got so prudish and puritanical with the scriptures that we have. To put it in prairie terms, the Proverbs father is saying, look, bud, there are some good-looking, smooth-talking, sexually available people out there. They want you, you want them, but if you want life, you need discipline. This is the tone of the talk that I got from my father in an 85 short box Chevy driving back from youth group. Did I want to open that door and take my chances with the asphalt at 110 kilometers an hour? You bet. Am I glad he did it? You bet. Sexual self-control is a necessary skill in the art of living. Self-control is a necessary skill in the art of living. Again, scholars agree, Proverbs 1-9 is using the stranger woman and Lady Wisdom as foils for one another. As one scholar says, adultery is not only a sin that exacts payment, it's the ultimate symbol of the fool's pathway. And we know this because of the way that Proverbs 1-9 is capped off. In chapter 9, we see Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly both making their invitations. We read, Wisdom has built her house. She has set up its 7 pillars. She's prepared her meat and mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her servants, and she calls from the highest point in the city. Let all who are simple come to my house. To those who have no sense, she says, come, eat my food, drink the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways, and you will live. Walk in the way of insight. Folly, in chapter 13, makes her invitation. Folly is an unruly woman. She is simple and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house on a seat at the highest point in the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way. Let all who are simple come to my house. Notice it's the same invitation. To those who have no sense, she says, stolen water is sweet. Food eaten in secret is delicious. But little do they know that the dead are there, that her guests are deep in the realm of the dead. Wisdom's a woman, folly's a woman. Both are out in the street making their invitation. The audience is a young man. And then the whole book of Proverbs ends with chapter 31, starting at verse 10, which so many bad women's retreats. So many. The good wife passage, right? Early Jewish interpreters, most Christian scholars will tell you, this is actually probably a return to the allegory of Lady Wisdom, right? The whole book of Proverbs is bookended with this question: who are you going to marry? Who's going to be your partner in life? Foolishness or wisdom? Because it's poetry, it encourages us to read it at a deeper level. This is about more than just sex. The stranger woman is described in clear terms. She's attractive. The references are in your notes. She's attractive. She's smooth-talking. She's making an enticing offer, complete with aromatherapy. Okay? Wisdom is not described in physical terms. All we get told about wisdom is that she is valuable. One of the last verses in the book actually riffs on this comparison, right, between the value and the beauty. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. It's like, okay, is wisdom just like an ugly duckling, right? Like what's going on here? But as a principle, I think this is an encouragement in general. It's saying wisdom is about seeking a life of value. Foolishness is about seeking a life of pleasure. Wisdom is about seeking a life of value. Foolishness is about seeking a life of pleasure. You could depict the difference between foolishness and wisdom graphically. Things like illicit drugs, promiscuous sex, and deep-fried butter. These are all intense spikes in pleasure. But often they're accompanied by these deep valleys. This is true neurobiologically, regardless of guilt and shame. You wake up and you're like, what did I do last night, right? And worse yet, over time, you get diminishing returns. You have to do more of it and you get less pleasure from it. Eventually, these activities don't even really give pleasure. You just need them to get back to baseline functioning. But things like committed relationships, hard work, vegetables, they may not spike your pleasure as much initially, but you don't crash as hard either. You see, our brains, they're plastic, they're not steel. When we prioritize the right things, our bodies and brains begin to find pleasure in them. Talk to someone who's gone to the gym consistently for a few years. They don't dread it, they love it. Talk to someone who has a healthy marriage that has had like years of work and maybe some deep valleys too. Generally, they're going to speak so positively about their experience. Right? Speak to somebody who's developed a habit of prayer. They yearn for those quiet moments. Our actions train our desires. We're training ourselves to love beneficial things or damaging things. And for a moment, this is what makes porn so devastating. Right? Porn actually warps our desires. It's training our brains. Specialists talk about it as a drug. There's this cycle of chasing the high that you once had and usually needing to consume more extreme content just to get back there. If you're using, please talk to somebody. Man or woman, it's not just a male issue anymore, okay? This is something that needs to come to light because you can get clean. You can retrain your brain. So what does discipline look like if this is kind of what wisdom and folly are with regards to pleasure and time? Well, let's use the image given in Proverbs, adultery. And say you're working with somebody and you start to feel attraction and desire. First off, ethicists will tell you feeling desire, feeling attraction, that's not crossing a moral line. You can't control that. That's part of being human. You cross the line when you start to obsess and fantasize and eventually act on those desires. So discipline is about building a life where you can create a buffer between desire and action. And in that buffer, we're encouraged to do some future thinking. So in this situation, right, say you feel the desire, you think through all the possible, okay, so you try to act on it. What if the other person isn't interested and then you're shamed or you're kicked out of your job? What if they are interested, you engage? Nobody ever gets away with this stuff, right? Eventually it gets figured out. What's the damage going to be to your reputation, to your family? Like, go all the way there. Imagine sitting in divorce court. Imagine having to go get your kids only on the weekend. Right? Wisdom plays the long game. Foolishness gets caught up in the moment. Wisdom invests in value. Foolishness seeks momentary pleasure. Discipline is not repressive, it's reflective. The disciplined person chooses their life. They're not caught up just in their desires. It's a fruit of the Spirit, self-control, that's meant to help us be free. So if you're young and you're in this room, I'd encourage you, get wisdom, seek value, challenge yourself. Yeah, you could spend your young years partying and playing video games and jumping from boyfriend to boyfriend or girlfriend to girlfriend. Or you could get a job where you need to learn some skills. You could pick up a musical instrument. You can make real friends in real life in the real world. One way will feel good in the short term. The other may be a little difficult to start, but it will give you more value over the long run. Wisdom doesn't want you peaking in high school, okay? Enough said. So Proverbs 7 brings us back to this theme, and it's the longest portion on the stranger and adultery in Proverbs 1-9. The father figure paints a picture for the young man. He says, I looked out my window, and I saw this young man walking on the street. And then we read in verse 10, then out came a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute with crafty intent. She's unruly and defiant, her feet never stay at home. Now in the street, now in the squares, at every corner she lurks. She took hold of him and kissed him, and with a brazen face she said, today I fulfilled my vows, and I have food from my fellowship offering at home. So I came out to meet you, I looked for you, and have found you. And at verse 21, with persuasive words she led him astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk. All at once he followed her like an ox going to slaughter, like a deer stepping in the noose. Notice the predatory language here. She's out in the streets lurking. She's set traps, right? One biblical scholar, I really appreciate this because it just kind of helps with the gendered language thing. She rewrites this little section as a paraphrase to her daughters. And she writes, do not be misled by handsome faces, by beautiful bodies, by the right clothes or correct manners. Especially, do not be deluded by flatterers who would tell you you are beautiful. Of course you are. And then ask you to give them your body and soul. The pretty boys and jocks will beckon you. They'll ask you to go out. Soon they will ask you to bed. It's a dangerous world. Their ways lead to death, not just moral death, but physical death as well. See, it's not just as simple as protecting ourselves from ourselves, developing just like self-control. The reality is we're out in the world with people who have hearts and intentions that are hidden from us. So protecting ourselves relates to actually having really good boundaries to protect us when our self-control could fail. Earlier in chapter 5, the father gives this wonderful advice to his son. He says, keep to a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house. I've been on a journey with discipline in all the areas of my life. And what I've learned about it has surprised me. If you give me a bag of Miss Vicky's sweet and spicy ketchup chips, I finish it in one sitting. I have tried for years to stop myself from doing this. I can't. I just can't. You open that bag, it's gone. And I used to think self-control would be like opening the bag and eating 3 chips. There are people who do that. Like, how? Okay? What I've learned is that discipline is not having the chips in the cupboard. See, really disciplined people don't have like super buff brains. Really disciplined people make it as hard as possible to do the thing they don't want to do. They make decisions ahead of time to put barriers in the way of the behaviors they do not want to engage in. Don't even walk down her street. We're talking about boundaries, right? Protecting ourselves, taking personal responsibility by thinking ahead of time. In my experience, journeying with people, porn use often requires these kind of things. It's not just like, again, having a super buff brain. It's like, get a flip phone, right? Or just keep your phone out of your room at night. Make sure all of your computers are in common areas. Right? Download programs that will send a message to somebody. There's many of them out there that are very cheap that will send a message to somebody if you use porn. Right? Let somebody in to know how you're dealing with these issues. Right? If your right hand causes you to sin, Jesus says, don't just try harder, cut it off. Make it hard to do. And in our interactions out in the world, in real life, we should have developed boundaries and rules about how we interact with people. Right? You got to work with people that you might be attracted to. You make boundaries like making sure your meetings are only in public, only at those meeting times, only talking about the things that relate to your work. If you're married, you let your spouse know when those meetings are happening. Married or no, each of us has a private mental sex life that we should have a close friend we can talk to about, that we can be honest about when we are feeling something or we're getting a strange vibe from someone. This is not about hypersexualizing people. This is just being shrewd and wise, protecting ourselves and protecting others from the worst in us. They're great things to have conversations with people about, to work out in prayer, and they're a little different for all of us, but we've got to have them. And before we move on to this passage opens up an opportunity to talk about something that's not necessarily related to wisdom or boundaries per se. It's the reality of just sexual abuse. It's a part of our world. If it's part of your story, I am so deeply grieved for you. And I encourage you to reach out for help and seek healing, to build relationships where you can share that part of your story. And professional help is really important in this area. But we've got to talk about this because, as Dave said last week, what Proverbs is giving us a template for is talking about hard stuff with our kids. Our kids need to know what's appropriate and what isn't. We need to have a culture where, sensitive to their age, we can bring things up and talk about the realities that they're experiencing out in the world. We can talk about what they've seen on a computer or seen in movies. And there are good guides out there. There are people who have given a lot of thought to this. Pastor Dave and Pastor Jill are further along in parenting. I'd encourage you to seek their wisdom. But we got to be bold. It's uncomfortable, but we live in the real world. We got to be courageous. And we have an abuse prevention policy here at Summit for these reasons as well, right? People who work with our youth, our kids, our vulnerable populations, they're screened for criminal records. We train them. They're supervised. And we ask as a community that we just respect this high standard too. And unless it's an event where you're explicitly invited, don't hang around too much, right? We're trying to make sure that the screened people are the ones interacting with our kids. It's the real world. It's uncomfortable, but we're being encouraged to think about it. So why do we need to do all this talk about all of these things? We need to protect ourselves and the people we're responsible for. And again, there's a general principle that goes beyond just sex and adultery in this passage. Right? At the core, adulterous behavior is selfish. Right? Anybody who's been affected by it or done it themselves, generally if they've done the work, they'll tell you, yeah, that's true. They'll use stronger language. Right? To dismiss the cost on your own marriage or somebody else's for moments of physical gratification, it's selfish. Wisdom is selfless. And again, Proverbs 31, I think, is to be read as this personification of Lady Wisdom. It's wise principles for everyone. And one of the primary characteristics we read about wisdom is her care for those around her. She gets up while it is still night. She provides food for her family and portions for her female servants. It goes on to talk about how she clothes her household, how she opens her hands to the poor. Right? Biblical wisdom, again, isn't just about killing it at life personally. It's not just eat, pray, love, self-help. Biblical wisdom points us towards relationship. One of the Proverbs that's just leapt off the page to me in my own reading is that a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Generosity is about more than finances. It's like a relational character trait. Am I the type of person who goes into my relationships trying to refresh people, trying to bring life? Do I keep my promises? And the longest study that Harvard has ever done on longevity and overall happiness has found that long-term relationships are at the core of it. You live longer, you live more satisfied if you keep your relational promises. And that's why in Scripture, adultery is always tied to idolatry, right? That the prophets take this theme and they relate it to our relationship with God. They say, there's a tendency in us for selfish gains to break our promises, not just to each other, but to God. It's choosing, again, a life of short-term pleasure over long-term value. So living in this area of our lives as faithful as we can to what the Scriptures teach, this is our reasonable worship. This is offering our bodies as living sacrifices. This is becoming the type of people that God has made us to be. The worship team can come forward now. Wisdom, again, isn't just about killing it at life and our own gain. Wisdom creates a kind of world. It creates an atmosphere that increases wisdom or diminishes it. Right? Part of the question we're asking when we talk about this stuff, if you'll remember from the beginning, is what kind of a world are we creating with our actions? One of the things I love to say to young couples when they're getting married is that their marriage is public art. Right? Beyond just being about them, marriage is a place where we can show the world what love can be like, what Jesus' love can be like. Paul says, right, that this mystery of marriage is about Jesus and the church. So we've got to ask ourselves, are we building the type of kingdom world that God wants us to build in this area? Who will you choose with your life? Who will be your partner? Wisdom or folly?